Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about an enslaved family's horrifying revenge in the Appalachian Mountains that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. Smoke. That was the first thing one noticed. The first question mark against the vast canvas of the Appalachian sky. It wasn't the hearty, intermittent plume of a homesteader's hearth, but a thin, gray column, constant and unnervingly persistent. It rose from the stone chimney of the Harwick family smokehouse, a stubborn spire of gray against the deep greens of summer and the stark whites of winter. For years, it had been a landmark, a strange beacon in the vast, untamed wilderness of the Blue Ridge Mountains of Western Virginia. But in the bitter winter of 1847, that smoke began to carry a different weight, a more sinister meaning that drifted on the frigid air. The scent was changing. Beneath the familiar, sharp aroma of hickory and oak, a richer, heavier note lingered, something almost sweet. A scent that clung to the back of the throat and unsettled the soul. Travelers on the rare, treacherous paths that snaked through these mountains would see it from a distance and quicken their pace. The few neighboring families, whose homesteads were separated by a full day's brutal ride, whispered amongst themselves during their infrequent encounters at a distant settlement. For months, they hadn't seen livestock on the Harwick property. The fields lay fallow, but the pastures eerily silent. The familiar sounds of a working farm, the lowing of cattle. The squeal of hogs being fattened for slaughter had vanished, replaced by an unnerving quiet, broken only by the howl of the wind. So, the question hung in the air, as tangible as the smoke itself. What was being cured in that stone building, day after day, week after week, with such relentless dedication? This isn't a ghost story whispered around a hearth to frighten children. This is a chilling chronicle, a tale from the cold, hard memory of the mountains, a story of human desperation pushed to its breaking point, and a primordial vengeance enacted in the most horrifying way imaginable. It forces us to confront a question that chills me to the bone when the structures of civilization and justice are stripped away, leaving only the raw wilderness and the darker wilderness of the human heart. What bloody price does survival demand? To truly understand the unspeakable secret that the smoke concealed, we must journey back to its beginning, to a place where the land itself seemed to hold a ravenous, ancient hunger. In the year 1847, the Harwick homestead was a world unto itself, nestled deep within a valley that seemed carved out by a resentful god. It was a nearly 2,000-acre wound in the wilderness, insulated from the outside world by a formidable geography of granite cliffs, dense forests, and treacherous passes that became utterly impassable in winter. A single snake-like trail, known only to the family, was the sole artery connecting it to the rest of civilization. This isolation wasn't an accident. It was a carefully cultivated asset. For Marcus Harwick, the family patriarch, it was a perfect shield. Here, in the shadow of ancient oaks that clawed at the sky and a morning mist that clung to the ground like a shroud, the laws of the federal government were but a distant, irrelevant echo. Marcus's kingdom, his personal empire, was built upon a foundation of three things: the illicit, high-proof moonshine he distilled in a hidden cave, the absolute isolation that protected his operation, and the unlimited, unexamined cruelty he inflicted upon the 6 human beings he legally owned. The land itself was steeped in a history far darker than illicit whiskey. According to the fragmented oral histories gathered decades later from the descendants of early settlers, the Cherokee, who had hunted these same valleys for generations before their forced removal, had a name for this place, the Hungry Valley. They spoke of it as a cursed land, a place where the earth itself had soured, where game grew scarce for no reason and plants withered in fertile soil. Cherokee law warned that the spirits of those who died violently here could find no rest, their hunger keeping them tethered to the valley floor. To Marcus Harwick, a man of cold pragmatism, these were the foolish superstitions of a displaced people. He couldn't see that his own actions were nurturing a new and far more terrible hunger, a hunger born not of restless spirits, but of living flesh and blood, pushed to the brink of despair. The social and legal landscape of antebellum Virginia bolted the doors of this natural prison. The fugitive slave laws were a guarantee of brutal reprisal. Any attempt to escape, if it didn't end in death by starvation or exposure in the unforgiving mountains, would inevitably end in capture and a return to a fate far worse than death. The homestead's isolation, therefore, was a double-edged sword. It kept lawmen and prying eyes out, but it also locked hope in, extinguishing every spark before it could catch fire in the hearts of the enslaved. And in this isolated kingdom, the Harwick family were not merely landowners. They were absolute monarchs, tyrants who ruled a kingdom of 6 subjects through fear and pain. Marcus Harwick was the architect, a man whose ambition was as sharp and cold as the steel he used to brand his cattle. He saw opportunity where others saw only hardship, building his profitable moonshine operation with shrewd calculation. Yet his wife, Eleanor, was the true enforcer, the heart of the family's cruelty. She wasn't the elegant, distant plantation mistress of popular fiction, educated and articulate, as later discovered letters would reveal. Her cruelty was methodical and deeply personal. Accounts described her as ruling with a heavy leather whip that always hung coiled by the kitchen door, an instrument she wielded with a terrifying, dispassionate proficiency. Their 3 grown sons, David, William, and James, were products of this brutal incubator. David, the eldest, seemed to have inherited his mother's sadistic creativity. William and James were less imaginative in their cruelty, but no less compliant. Their humanity eroded by years of participating in the family's violent control. Opposing this force of casual brutality were the 6 captive souls. Courthouse records, discovered decades later in a dusty basement, listed their names with the cold efficiency of a livestock inventory. Samuel, age 28, his wife Ruth, 26, their 2 children, Moses, 12, and Sarah, 8, and 2 other unrelated men, Joshua and Thomas. Their journey to this mountain prison had been a 2-week ordeal in iron shackles, but these names on a ledger represented resilient, complex human beings. Samuel, before his enslavement, had been a skilled carpenter. He possessed a keen analytical mind that could see the structure and flaws in any system, whether it was a building or a hierarchy of power. His face was a mask of compliance, but his eyes never stopped observing. They catalogued every detail, the rusty squeal of a particular barn door hinge, the exact time of day the dogs were fed, and by whom, the way Eleanor's shadow fell across the yard as she made her nightly rounds. Ruth, his wife, worked in the main house as a cook and seamstress. She moved with a quiet grace that belied a core of unyielding strength, her proximity to the family giving her a unique vantage point. She learned their habits, their preferences, their arguments whispered when they thought no one was listening. Joshua and Thomas, strong men, accustomed to the grueling labor of tobacco fields, adapted their endurance to felling trees and hauling water from frozen streams. The children, Moses and Sarah, learned to make themselves small and invisible, their youthful innocence slowly being petrified into a hard, watchful resilience. Together, they formed a tight-knit family, bound by a shared, unspoken suffering. In this place, the first signs of an impending cataclysm were not a clash of weapons or a shouted threat. They were subtler, quieter. It was the contrast between the Harwick's loud, confident brutality and the deliberate, almost meditative silence of Samuel, while the Harwicks saw only compliant bodies. Samuel saw their vulnerabilities. He was a carpenter, and in his mind, he was beginning to measure not lumber, but the load-bearing beams and the rotten floorboards of the oppressive structure that imprisoned them all. The first seeds of a terrifying, inevitable confrontation were being sown, one that would soon determine who the true prey was in the depths of the Hungry Valley. The catalyst for the storm that would engulf the Hungry Valley arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the hollow sound of a boot heel striking a loose floorboard. It was an accident, a moment of carelessness from David Harwick as he returned to the main house late one February afternoon. The sound was just unusual enough to catch his father's attention. Marcus Harwick's profitable, illicit business had been built on a foundation of paranoia and meticulous control. Any deviation from the norm was a threat to be investigated. After a few minutes of prying with a crowbar, he revealed a small hidden cavity beneath the floor of the enslaved quarters, and inside lay the evidence of a meticulously planned betrayal. There, nestled in the dark space, was a small cache of stolen supplies, strips of dried meat wrapped in oilcloth, a precious handful of salt, and, most damning of all, two items that served as a death warrant. The first was a brass compass, glinting dully in the encroaching twilight, which Marcus immediately recognized as having belonged to his son, William. The second was a piece of tanned deerskin, carefully folded. When Marcus unrolled it, his breath caught in his throat. It was a hand-drawn map, rendered with surprising skill and detail. It depicted the treacherous mountain passes, the hidden streams, and the safest routes leading north, toward the promise of Pennsylvania and freedom. Samuel's quiet observations had not been idle. They had been reconnaissance. That evening, the evidence lay spread across the main kitchen table, illuminated by the sickly yellow glow of whale oil lamps. The map fell like a living accusation, a silent verdict in the tense room for the Harwick family. This was not merely an escape plan. It was a declaration of war, an unforgivable act of rebellion against their absolute authority. Eleanor ran a thumb along the edge of a butcher knife, which she was sharpening against a whetstone with slow, methodical strokes. The rhythmic, grating sound filled the room. "Soft hearts breed rebellion," she muttered, her thin lips pressed into a line her sons had learned to fear. "I told you, Marcus, your mercy is a weakness. This is what comes of it." Her gaze was cold, devoid of any emotion save a chilling, practical fury. The plan they devised was as simple as it was brutal. There would be no trial, no pretense of justice. They would make an example of the carpenter, the leader. At midnight, they would drag Samuel from his quarters, force the other 5 to watch, and hang him from the main beam of the smokehouse. His body would remain there through the spring thaw, a permanent, frozen testament to the price of defiance. James, the youngest son, had already prepared the noose, using techniques passed down from a grandfather who had dispensed vigilante justice in the backwoods of Kentucky. They spoke in low, confident tones, their arrogance so complete that they never considered the possibility that their own home, their fortress, could betray them. They believed they were the hunters, setting a final, decisive trap for their most dangerous prey. But arrogance is a poor soundproofing material, and on a night of crystalline, sub-zero cold, sound travels with unforgiving clarity. Through the thin log walls of their quarters, separated from the main house by only a few yards of frozen earth, Samuel and the others heard every word. They heard the discovery, the cold fury in Eleanor's voice, and the detailed, matter-of-fact discussion of Samuel's impending execution. The death sentence, meant to be a secret until the final, terrifying moment, had been delivered in advance. And in that instant, the calculus of survival shifted irrevocably. The desperate, long-term plan for freedom was dead. A new plan was needed, a plan for war, to be executed not in weeks or months, but in mere hours. The pressure in the small, cramped cabin became immense, a palpable force that seemed to suck the very air from the room. Fear was there, a cold knot in the pit of every stomach, but it was overshadowed by something far more potent, the stark clarity of men and women with absolutely nothing left to lose. Samuel's months of quiet planning had not just been for escape. He had been preparing for this, for the moment when he had to drop the mask of submission. He had learned from the whispers of old-timers in the settlement, tales of how Cherokee warriors had used the terrain, the weather, and the isolation of these very mountains to their advantage. He had learned that the most effective weapon was to turn an enemy's strength into their greatest weakness. With a quiet intensity that commanded absolute obedience, Samuel outlined the counterplan. It was a horrifying mirror image of the Harwick's own intentions. The location would be the same, the smokehouse. The purpose, however, would be inverted. This would not be an execution. It would be an ambush. Every piece of knowledge they had painstakingly gathered over 4 years of servitude now became a weapon. Ruth knew Eleanor's nightly routine with unwavering certainty, a final check of the smokehouse fires around 12:30 a.m. A ritual performed alone. Every single night, Joshua and Thomas had, under the guise of maintenance, tested the strength of the heavy iron meat hooks that hung from the rafters, discovering they were not just sharp, but easily removed. Young Moses, with the innocent invisibility of a child, had mapped the family's sleeping arrangements, noting which rooms contained firearms. The irony was devastating. While the Harwicks planned to use the smokehouse as a theater of terror, their intended victims had chosen it as a killing ground for reasons of brutal practicality and symbolic justice. The weather itself had become their silent accomplice. Weather records from a 19th century almanac preserved at the Virginia State Library note that the temperature that night plummeted to 18 degrees below zero. Such extreme cold created conditions crucial to their plan. Metal became brittle. The frozen ground would muffle footsteps and refuse to hold tracks. And most importantly, the family's normally vigilant hunting dogs had been brought inside the main house for warmth. Their warning barks silenced at precisely midnight, just as the Harwicks settled into what they believed was their last sleep before the morning's grim work. Samuel made his move. He slipped from a window whose latch he had carefully and patiently loosened over many nights, melting into the crushing, absolute darkness. The first move in a deadly chess game had been made. The smokehouse stood as a dark silhouette against a sky littered with gold, indifferent stars. Inside, it was a butcher's cathedral, consecrated to the methodical dismemberment of animal flesh. The air was thick with the overwhelming, cloying smell of cured meat and years of hickory smoke. Chains and hooks hung from the high rafters like instruments of torture in a medieval dungeon. And the massive cutting tables were stained a deep, dark brown from the lifeblood of countless animals. The dying coals from the day's smoking still glowed a faint, malevolent red in the central fire pit. Samuel used them to rekindle a small, controlled flame, just enough to see by, before positioning himself behind the main support beam, where the shadows were deepest. He did not wait long. One by one, the others slipped out of the quarters and joined him, moving with the preternatural silence of ghosts. Joshua arrived, carrying a length of rope they had braided from scraps of hemp found in the barn. Thomas followed, his hands full with a selection of tools whose original purposes skinning deer. Cleaving bone would soon be forgotten. Even young Moses had his role. Stationed as a lookout in the frozen darkness outside, a small brave shadow whose job was to signal if any family member besides Eleanor approached. The tension inside the stone building was absolute. It was the silence of hell breaths, of pounding hearts, of a single, collective will focused on the squeal of a door hinge. At precisely 12:28 a.m., Eleanor appeared, a dark figure wrapped in a heavy cloak against the bitter cold. She carried a flickering pine torch in one hand and a long iron poker in the other. Her breath formed white clouds in the frigid air as she trudged through the snow, completely unaware that her rigid, predictable routine, once a symbol of her control, had just become the instrument of her doom. The door opened with its familiar, agonizing squeal. She stepped inside, holding the torch high. The light danced across hanging slabs of venison and wild boar, casting wild, moving shadows that could have concealed an army. She took 2 steps toward the fire pit, her back to the main support beam. One moment, she was the mistress of her domain. The next, his hands, hardened by years of carpentry into living clamps of wood and muscle, closed around her throat. She never saw Samuel. The poker clattered to the stone floor. Her mouth opened in a silent, strangled scream that was crushed before it could be born. Joshua moved immediately to bar the door while Thomas snatched the fallen torch and plunged it back into the coals. Bringing the lead back to life, it revealed Eleanor's bulging eyes, wide with a final, dawning horror, the terror of understanding that death had arrived ahead of schedule, uninvited, and wearing the face of her property. The struggle lasted less than 3 minutes. But in that time, 4 years of accumulated debt began to be repaid, with an interest that would be measured in blood and bone. The point of no return had been crossed, and the hungry valley was about to be fed. The first light of dawn on February 15th, 1847, crept over the Blue Ridge Mountains, casting a cold, blue glow upon a world that had been irrevocably altered during the night. Inside the main house, Marcus Harwick woke not to a specific sound, but to an absence of it. For over 2 decades, his mornings had begun with the familiar rhythm of Eleanor's movements in the kitchen below the soft creak of floorboards, the rattle of the cast-iron stove door, the faint humming as she prepared their breakfast. Today, there was only silence, a profound and unnerving void that felt more threatening than any scream. He pulled on his boots, a knot of irritation tightening in his stomach, assuming his wife had risen extra early to tend to the fires after the execution of the carpenter, a grim task he now had to face. When he entered the kitchen, the scene that greeted him was not one of neglect, but of an impossible, chilling perfection. A fire roared in the hearth, chasing the worst of the cold from the room. On the heavy oak table, breakfast was laid out, steaming hot, as if served only moments before. The coffee was brewed to the exact strength he preferred, sweetened with the precise measure of honey he had trained Eleanor to use. Beside it, arranged on her best china, were strips of freshly smoked meat. Everything was perfect, which was precisely why everything was wrong. His sons, drawn from their beds by the unfamiliar silence, gathered at the table, their faces etched with confusion. "Where is Mother?" William asked, his voice rough with sleep. Marcus had no answer. He scanned the kitchen, a frantic energy building within him. The doors were barred from the inside, just as they had left them. The windows showed no signs of tampering. Whoever had prepared this meal possessed an intimate, impossible knowledge of their family's routines. David, the most observant of the sons, picked up a strip of the smoked meat. "This is new," he muttered, studying it closely. "I don't remember her putting any new cuts at the smokehouse yesterday." James took a bite, chewing slowly. "It tastes different," he said, his eyes widening slightly. "Richer, somehow, more tender than the venison." It was undeniably delicious, a fact that was, in itself, deeply disturbing. A shared, unspoken dread propelled them out into the biting morning air and towards the smokehouse. The building appeared normal, the familiar now unsettling. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney, but as Marcus pushed open the heavy door, the wrongness intensified. The interior was meticulously organized. The fires burned at the optimal temperature. Even the butchering tools had been cleaned and arranged with Eleanor's typical precision. But there was too much meat. Fresh cuts, far exceeding their recent hunting yields, hung from the rafters in neat, orderly rows. Marcus, who knew the rhythm of their operations by heart, understood that this quantity of processing would have taken hours of relentless work. As his sons examined the new stock, Marcus's eyes were drawn to the massive cutting tables. They had been scrubbed clean, but the deep grain of the wood held fresh. Dark stains that weren't there the day before. A bucket of reddish-brown water sat beside one table, a thin film of ice forming on its surface. Eleanor was meticulous. She never left standing water in her workspace. Then, William made the discovery that tipped their confusion into sheer terror. Hidden beneath a pile of salt-curing sacks, he found a small collection of tools that did not belong in the smokehouse. There were Eleanor's sewing scissors, a fine carving knife from the dining room set, and, glinting with a horrifying familiarity in the dim light, the straight-wristed head from Marcus's own shaving kit. These were not the tools of a butcher. They were the instruments of a surgeon, suggesting a level of precision and intimacy that made the blood run cold. They were no longer just looking for a missing woman. They were standing in the middle of a meticulously documented, yet utterly incomprehensible, crime scene. "Looking for something." The voice came from directly behind William, calm and conversational, cutting through the tense silence of the smokehouse. He spun around to find a sight that shattered the very foundations of his world. Standing in the doorway, blocking the only exit, were all 6 of them. Samuel stood at the center, a heavy meat cleaver held loosely in his right hand, its polished blade reflecting the orange glow of the fire. Ruth was beside him, a long, thin filleting knife in her grasp. Joshua and Thomas flanked them, armed with other tools from the workshop. Even young Moses held a weapon, a long quilting needle, sharpened to a deadly point, that William recognized as one of his mother's. They were not haggard or fearful. They appeared healthy, well-fed, and possessed a chilling, absolute calm. "Where is my mother?" William demanded, his voice choked with an authority he no longer possessed. Samuel's expression did not change. He gestured with the cleaver towards the neat rows of meat hanging from the rafters above them. "Your mother is exactly where she belongs," he replied, his tone as matter-of-fact as if he were discussing the weather. "She's providing sustenance for the people she spent 4 years trying to starve." The implication struck William with the force of a physical blow. The impossible breakfast, the unfamiliar flavor of the meat, the sheer quantity of new stock, the surgical tools, it all coalesced into a single, monstrous truth that his mind refused to accept. "That's impossible," he whispered, shaking his head. "People don't. We don't. People don't what?" "William, It was Ruth who spoke now, her voice devoid of heat, yet carrying the weight of an executioner's judgment. People don't eat other people. Your family has been consuming human flesh for months. The only difference now is that you know where it came from. This was not a confession of a crime. It was a proclamation of a new and terrible justice. Samuel took a step forward, his eyes locking with William's. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted, shattered, and remade in this cold, smoky chamber. Your mother taught us many things during her final hours, Samuel said, his voice dropping to an almost intimate, educational tone. She was very helpful. She taught us how to properly section a carcass for maximum yield, which cuts require longer curing times to be palatable. The importance of removing all bone fragments to prevent spoilage. He picked up Eleanor's own butcher knife from the table and tested its razor-sharp edge against his thumb. A thin line of blood welled up, but he showed no reaction. She was very educational, he repeated softly, right up until the end. Even helped us understand which seasonings work best with this particular type of meat. William tried to back away, but Thomas and Joshua had moved to block his path. The smokehouse, which had always represented security and sustenance for his family, had transformed into a trap. Looking past Samuel, he saw that several of the heavy meat hooks had been modified. They were now fitted with additional restraints, leather straps, and iron shackles that could hold a struggling human being securely during the butchering process. This was not a singular act of revenge. It was the beginning of a new system, a new harvest. "What do you want?" William asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What we've always wanted." Samuel replied simply, "Freedom. But since your family made that impossible, we've settled for something else." His gaze was unblinking. "We want justice, and we want to survive the winter. Your family has provided us with both." In that moment of crystal clarity, William Harwick understood two things with absolute certainty. First, that he was not leaving the smokehouse alive. And second, far more terrifying, was the understanding that his death would be neither quick nor merciful. It would be educational. He would learn, firsthand, exactly what it felt like to be reduced from master to meat. His screams echoed through the valley for precisely 17 minutes before the mountain finally swallowed them. The new order on the Harwick property was established with terrifying efficiency. While William's fate was being sealed, the other 3 Harwick men found themselves prisoners in their own home. The doors had been barricaded from the outside. The windows were too small for escape. And, in a stroke of meticulous planning, every single weapon, every rifle, pistol, and axe had been systematically removed from the house during the night. Their fortress had become their cage. From outside, Samuel's voice called to them, amplified by the cold, dense air. "This is what helplessness feels like," he stated, his voice devoid of triumph, filled only with a chilling finality. "This is what your property felt like to us. Every day. For 4 years." The property did not descend into chaos. It rose to a new level of productivity. The smokehouse operated at peak efficiency, its output carefully managed by Thomas. Joshua oversaw the salt curing operation with the same exacting detail Eleanor had once demanded. They were not just surviving, they were building a new enterprise on the ashes of the old. A few days later, this horrifying new reality received its first unwitting witness, a traveling preacher named Ezekiel Thornton, making his way through the mountains, passed by the property. His journal, discovered decades later in a Methodist church archive, provides a chilling snapshot of the scene. He wrote, "The Harwick property appeared prosperous and well maintained. Smoke rose steadily from their smokehouse. and I observed several Negroes working industriously around the outbuildings, a model of mountain self-sufficiency. Though I wondered at seeing no sign of the family themselves. The preacher had no way of knowing he was documenting the complete success of a revolution. The industrious Negroes were free people operating a business. The absent family members were closer than he could ever imagine, hanging in neat, curing strips inside the very building he admired. Samuel's group had not just seized power, they had seized the means of production, and they were proving to be better at it than their former masters. When a federal revenue agent named Joseph McKinley arrived a few weeks later to investigate reports of moonshine production, he was met by Samuel, who presented himself as a freedman hired to manage the property while the Harwicks were away visiting relatives in Richmond. The explanation, combined with the obvious efficiency of the operation and the high quality of the whiskey, was plausible enough. McKinley filed his report and moved on. The outside world, with its laws and assumptions, had looked directly at an act of systematic, cannibalistic revenge and had seen only a successful business. The first social and legal hurdles had been cleared, and the smoke continued to rise, a silent, fragrant testament to the new, brutal order of the Hungry Valley. The harshest winter in the Blue Ridge's recorded history finally began to release its grip with the reluctant arrival of spring in 1848. As the snows melted, revealing the scarred, sodden earth beneath, the final methodical collapse of the Harwick dynasty reached its conclusion. Marcus, David, and James had been kept alive through the darkest, coldest months, not out of any lingering mercy, but out of a chillingly practical necessity. They were living repositories of knowledge, and Samuel, with the cold precision of a master craftsman dismantling a complex and corrupt machine, extracted every last piece of valuable information. Each piece of knowledge, a component of their identity as masters, was stripped away piece by piece, along with their flesh. The psychological toll on the surviving Harwick men was absolute. They were no longer human beings in the eyes of their captors, but livestock. A comparison made all the more horrifying by their full awareness of the process. They were forced to endure the scent of the smokehouse, a smell they had once associated with prosperity and power, now transformed into the constant, nauseating perfume of their own family's annihilation. Marcus Harwick, the patriarch, suffered the most profound disintegration. The architect of this brutal kingdom was forced to watch its complete inversion, his authority rendered meaningless, his commands met with cold silence, his very existence reduced to a set of valuable secrets to be harvested before the final butchering. He became a ghost in his own home, a man hollowed out by a terror so complete that it consumed him long before the knives ever did. The process was a horrifying parody of education. They were forced to teach their former slaves the very business secrets that had once been the source of their power, ensuring a seamless transfer of operational control. The last to be taken was Marcus himself. By then, he was little more than a shell, a king who had been forced to watch his lineage dismantled, catalogued, and consumed before his very eyes. His death marked the final payment on a 4-year debt of suffering. By the time the first wildflowers bloomed in the valley, the last of the Harwick family had been fully processed through the smokehouse, their nutritional contribution having sustained the 6 survivors through to the promise of a new season. The redefinition was complete. They were no longer victims, but the proprietors of a grimly successful enterprise, a community forged in a crucible of unimaginable violence. During this time, Ruth had undertaken a task of her own, a project that spoke to the profound psychological transformation the group had undergone. In a systematic search of the main house, She discovered Eleanor's handwritten recipe collection, but her interest was not in pies or preserves. Tucked in the back were detailed instructions for curing various types of game, including chillingly prophetic notes on preparing long pork for extended storage, a term sometimes used by those in survival scenarios. It suggested Eleanor had, on some cold, intellectual level, contemplated the very desperation she inflicted upon others. Ruth, however, did not just follow these recipes, she refined them. She perfected them for their new, singular ingredient. Her own notebooks, discovered decades later, were not the diaries of a survivor, but the cold, scientific ledgers of a quartermaster. They contained precise measurements of yield from each carcass, nutritional analyses, and comparative taste evaluations based on different curing times and seasoning blends, she noted, with a chilling detachment. How the texture of the meat varied and which parts were best suited for stewing versus smoking. It was the detached, academic language of a new science born from an unspeakable act, a testament to how profoundly they had been reshaped by the choices they had made. The hungry valley had finally been fed, and, in the process, it had created something entirely new. But such a radical reordering of the world could not remain a secret forever. As the mountain passes cleared with the spring thaw, the story of what happened on the Harwick property began to seep into the surrounding communities, not as fact, but as a dark and troubling legend. The last person to claim first-hand knowledge of these events was a woman named Martha Delacroix, who passed away in 1923 at the age of 94, on her deathbed, surrounded by her family in a world of electricity and automobiles. She summoned her grandson, Thomas, and unburdened a secret she had carried for over 70 years. Ensuring the truth would not be completely buried beneath the comfortable lies communities tell themselves about their past. Her testimony, donated to the Virginia Historical Society in 1968, provides the most intimate and invaluable glimpse into the aftermath. As a young woman of 17, Martha had accompanied her father on a trading expedition to the property in the spring of 1848. The air of the place, she recalled, was different. The oppressive fear that had once clung to the valley like its morning mist was gone, replaced by an atmosphere of quiet, intense industry. Samuel was the smartest man I'd ever met, she whispered to her grandson, her voice a fragile rasp over the hum of the modern world. He could calculate measurements in his head faster than my father could write them down. Ruth's cooking, the food she shared with us, was better than anything we'd ever tasted. They presented themselves as a successful, hard-working mountain family, their competence undeniable. But Martha, with the keen eyes of youth, saw details that the adults, perhaps willfully, chose to ignore: the exceptional quality and abundance of the preserved meat despite no evidence of recent hunting success, the subtle but significant modifications to the smokehouse that spoke of a different methodology, and, most tellingly, the complete and total absence of any trace of the previous owners. I knew something had happened, she confessed, her eyes looking past her grandson, back into the mists of time. But I also knew it wasn't my place to ask questions. Mountain people survive by minding their own business. Her most startling revelation, however, concerned the group's final days in the valley. Samuel, a pragmatist to the end, knew their precarious, isolated peace could not last. He had negotiated the sale of the entire property to Martha's father, planning to take his family north to Ohio, where their legal status would be less ambiguous. But the sale never happened. One autumn night in late 1848, Samuel and his family simply vanished, taking only what they could carry on foot. They left behind a prosperous, fully operational homestead, a silent testament to their capabilities. Reaching a trembling hand beneath her mattress, Martha revealed her most precious secret, a small, intricately carved wooden box. Inside lay a collection of items that told a story more complex than a simple disappearance. There was a hand-carved wooden button from Samuel's coat, a child's faded hair ribbon that had belonged to Sarah, and a letter, written in Samuel's distinctive, elegant hand. The letter, dated October 15th, 1848, was not a confession, but a philosophical farewell, a document of profound and sorrowful intelligence. It read, "In part, we leave this property to those who can make better use of it than we could. The mountain gave us what we needed to survive. But survival is not the same as living. To live requires more than just the absence of chains. It requires the ability to choose your own moral boundaries and to live with the choices you have made. We have learned that some choices, once made, cannot be unmade, and their memory becomes a land in which you must live forever. The valley will always be hungry, but we will no longer be the ones to feed it." Martha's final secret was their destination. Her family, deeply moved and terrified by what they implicitly understood, had helped them connect with the burgeoning Underground Railroad. They made their way north, a perilous journey through a hostile country, eventually reaching the relative safety of Canada and settling near Detroit. Samuel became a teacher, Martha whispered, a faint, proud smile on her lips. Ruth opened a restaurant. The children grew up free and educated. They had escaped, not just their bondage, but the land that had demanded such a terrible price for their freedom. The legacy they left behind, however, became permanently entwined with the folklore of the region. The property retained its dark reputation, a place shunned after sundown. The stories mutated over time, becoming cautionary tales that served different purposes. For white families, it was a simplified warning about the dangers of excessive cruelty to one's property, a lesson in managing assets. For black communities, it was a whispered, coded legend of ultimate resistance, a grim proof that even under the most extreme circumstances, the will to be free could not be extinguished. The horrifying details were sanded away. But the core of the story, the complete disappearance of a slave-owning family and the subsequent success of their former slaves, remained a powerful and unsettling truth that lingered in the mountain's memory. Decades later, long after the whispers had faded into the realm of unbelievable folklore, modern science provided a final, chilling epilogue. Archaeological investigations of the former Harwick property, conducted in the 1980s, began to uncover evidence that disturbingly aligned with Martha Delacroix's deathbed account. They found the structural modifications to the smokehouse and distillery, reflecting techniques and an efficiency unknown to white operators of the period. But the most significant finding lay hidden beneath the packed earth floor of the smokehouse. A sealed chamber, a deliberate cache, contained a collection of personal effects from all members of both the Harwick family and Samuel's group, arranged with a strange, ritualistic care that suggested a memorial, a final, somber accounting of everything that had been lost and everything that had been done. And then came the final, irrefutable proof. Modern forensic analysis of bone fragments found scattered in the deep layers of the fire pit and mixed with the surrounding soil confirmed the presence of at least 4 adult human remains. The cut marks on the bones were systematic, consistent with methodical butchery, reflecting a sophisticated, chilling understanding of food preservation methods. The Hungry Valley had indeed claimed its payment in full. The debt was satisfied with an interest that compounded across generations. And so, the story leaves us with a question that echoes from that dark, cold valley, when a society's laws protect the oppressor and condemn the oppressed. What is the true nature of justice? What is its shape, its texture, its taste? Some say that on the coldest winter nights, when the mountain wind carries the scent of wood smoke through the hollows. You can still smell something cooking in the ruins of the Harwick smokehouse, a phantom scent that reminds us that justice, like hunger, is a craving that is never truly, fully satisfied.